The autumn of 1780 brought a suffocating darkness to the South Carolina Lowcountry. A gloom deepened not by the shortening days, but by the collapse of the Patriot cause. Charleston had fallen in May, a catastrophic defeat that left the southern colonies seemingly prostrate before the British crown. With the Continental Army shattered, the defense of liberty fell to scattered bands of partisans, men who operated on the fringes of military doctrine. Among them, General Francis Marion stood as the most persistent and elusive threat to British hegemony. On the night of November 7, 1780, the tension in the Santee River Valley materialized in the form of an unnatural illumination against the black horizon. To the casual observer, it might have appeared as a wildfire, common enough in the dry pine forests. However, to the trained eyes of Francis Marion and his scouts, the light told a different story. It was the glow of a massive bivouac, strategically positioned at the plantation of the late General Richard Richardson. Marion, a man of slight stature and reserved demeanor, observed the fires from the concealment of the scrub. He knew the Richardson estate well. The family were staunch patriots, their home a known harbor for resistance. But tonight, it housed a predator. Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, the young and ruthless commander of the British Legion, had arrived with a singular, venomous directive from Lord Cornwallis. Get at Mr. Marion. The British occupation of the Richardson plantation was a calculated act of psychological warfare. Tarleton, known for his unremitting tactics and the fear he inspired, had not merely encamped. He had engaged in a grotesque display of power. He ordered the body of General Richardson exhumed and left exposed, ostensibly to examine the face of a man of such character, but in reality to terrorize the widow, Mrs. Dorothy Richardson, and the local populace. Tarleton's strategy was one of deception. He lit huge bonfires, far more than necessary for his troops, creating the visual signature of a relaxed, perhaps careless encampment. It was a trap designed to lure the swamp fox into a night attack. Tarleton assumed that Marion, drawn by the target and the plight of the Richardson family, would strike, exposing his smaller force to the superior numbers and discipline of the Green Dragoons. Inside the plantation house, Mrs. Richardson found herself a prisoner in her own home, surrounded by the officers of the Legion. Yet the British commander underestimated the resilience of his hostess. Recognizing the trap Tarleton had laid, Mrs. Richardson moved to counter it. She knew Marion was likely near, watching the fires. She needed to warn him that this was not a vulnerable detachment, but the main body of Tarleton's force, complete with artillery and a determination to destroy him. In a moment of quiet bravery, she dispatched her son, Richard Richardson, Jr., to slip through the British lines. The boy, intimate with the geography of the plantation and the surrounding woods, navigated the perimeter unseen. He located Marion's scouts in the darkness and delivered the critical intelligence. Tarleton was waiting, his men armed and ready, his artillery positioned to sweep the approaches. Marion received the news with the stoic pragmatism that defined his command. The intelligence confirmed his suspicions. To attack would be suicide. The British force was too large, too well equipped. The trap had been identified, but the danger remained acute. Marion knew that as soon as Tarleton realized the bait had not been taken, the hunter would become the chaser. "We must move," Marion concluded. His strategy, influenced by his experience fighting the Cherokee 2 decades earlier, relied on asymmetry, fighting only when the terrain and circumstances favored him. Tonight, the advantage lay entirely with the British. As the British soldiers waited by their deceptive fires, expecting the crack of Patriot rifles from the darkness, Marion's brigade began a silent withdrawal. They turned their mounts toward the east, away from the solid ground of the plantation and toward the treacherous sanctuary of the swamps. They rode for Jack's Creek, moving deeper into the wilderness. Back at the plantation, as the night wore on and no attack came, the ruse began to unravel. A prisoner who had escaped Marion's custody, or perhaps a loyalist spy, made his way to Tarleton with news that shattered the British commander's patience. Marion was not attacking. He was gone. The reaction was immediate. Tarleton, furious at being outmaneuvered before a shot was fired, abandoned the pretense of the ambush. He ordered his troops to mount up. The Green Dragoons, the most feared cavalry unit in the South, swung into their saddles. The date was November 8, 1780. The sun was rising on what would become one of the most legendary pursuits of the war. The pursuit that erupted from the Richardson plantation on the morning of November 8th was a contest of endurance, logistics, and will. It was not a battle of lines and volleys, but a frantic race across 26 miles of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Tarleton drove his men with a dogged determination. He was not merely chasing a rebel officer, he was attempting to extinguish a symbol of resistance that Lord Cornwallis found increasingly intolerable. The British column was formidable, consisting of the elite Green Dragoons, light infantry, and 2 pieces of artillery. However, this strength was also a liability. The heavy guns and supply wagons churned the muddy roads into quagmires, slowing the advance and exhausting the horses. Marion, riding his captured sorrel gelding, Ball, led his men on a tortuous route designed to punish his pursuers. He headed for the head of Jack's Creek, then down the Pocotaligo River. The landscape was a weapon in Marion's hands. He chose paths that were narrow, choked with underbrush, and slick with mud. The Patriot militia, mounted on hardy marsh tackies, local horses adapted to the heat and soft ground, moved with a fluidity the British could not match. For 7 grueling hours, the chase continued. The heat of the Lowcountry, even in November, began to take its toll. The humidity wrapped around the soldiers like a wet wool blanket. British horses, driven beyond their limits by Tarleton's fury, began to fail. Reports indicate that some of the Legion's mounts dropped in their tracks from exhaustion, forcing proud dragoons to dismount and run alongside the column, gasping for air in the oppressive atmosphere. Marion utilized a classic delaying strategy. He deployed his rear guard, commanded by the capable Major John James, to harass the British vanguard. These were not pitched stands, but stinging strikes, sudden volleys of rifle fire from a dense thicket that forced the British to deploy for battle, only to find the enemy vanished by the time the lines were formed. Each deployment cost Tarleton precious minutes. Each false alarm drained the energy of his men. The route wound past the Richburg mill site and beyond, moving relentlessly toward the Black River. Marion's destination was Benbow's Ferry, a crossing that would put a significant water barrier between him and the dragoons. But before he could reach the safety of the river, he had to navigate the formidable obstacle of Ox Swamp. Ox Swamp was a watery morass, a place where the solid earth dissolved into a chaotic slurry of black water, cypress knees, and sucking mud. It was a landscape that defied conventional military movement. There were no roads here, only game trails known to the local hunters and the indigenous people. To enter the swamp was to leave the civilized world behind. Marion reached the edge of the swamp in the late afternoon. He did not hesitate. He signaled his men forward. The meek brigade plunged into the gloom, their horses wading through water that rose to their bellies. The canopy of ancient cypress trees closed overhead, blotting out the sun and plunging the column into a twilight darkness. Behind them, the vanguard of Tarleton's Green Dragoons burst out of the pine forest and pulled up short. The trail they had been following, churned deep by hundreds of hooves, simply disappeared into the wall of vegetation. Tarleton rode to the front of his column, his uniform stained with sweat and dust, his horse lathered and trembling. He peered into the shadowy expanse of Ox Swamp. He could hear nothing but the buzzing of insects and the distant, fading splash of water. The Patriot menace had not been caught. It had been absorbed by the land itself. The British commander sat motionless for a moment, the silence of the swamp mocking the fury of his chase. He looked at the impenetrable thicket, then back at his exhausted men and the artillery pieces that were sunk to their axles in the mud. He realized that to proceed was to risk the destruction of his entire force in a terrain where his cavalry tactics were useless. He had pushed his men for 26 miles. He had burned the energy of his legion. And now he stared into a void that offered no glory, only the promise of a slow, muddy defeat. To understand how Francis Marion could vanish into a morass like Ox Swamp and survive, one must understand the unique military community he had constructed. A brigade forged in the crucible of the South Carolina wilderness, operating under conditions that would have broken a conventional army. The swamp life of Marion's brigade was a testament to human endurance. The environment was hostile in every conceivable way. The swamps were breeding grounds for disease. Malaria, known then as recurrent fever, and smallpox were constant threats. The air hummed with the sound of mosquitoes, which attacked in clouds so dense they could drive men and horses to distraction. The brigade had no tents. They slept in the open air, wrapped in thin blankets, lying on damp ground that seeped cold into their bones. Logistically, the brigade existed on the razor's edge of starvation. They lacked the supply trains of the Continental Army. Their diet was meager, often consisting of nothing more than lean beef without salt and sweet potatoes scavenged from local farms or grown in hidden patches. Yet this deprivation was a source of strategic strength. Because they carried little, they could move fast. They were not tethered to a line of wagons. They were free to drift like smoke through the trees. Central to the daily survival of the general and his staff was a figure often marginalized in the historical record, Oscar Marion. An enslaved man, likely growing up alongside Francis on the Marion family plantation, Oscar was far more than a servant. In the egalitarian hardship of the swamp, he was a soldier, a bugler, and a confidant. He fought alongside Francis, rowed the flatboats that transported the general across the rivers, and prepared the food that kept the command alive. The presence of Oscar Marion and other African Americans in the brigade highlights the complex reality of the Southern campaign. While the British actively recruited enslaved people with promises of freedom, many, like Oscar, fought for the Patriot cause. The brigade was a diverse fighting force, composed of Huguenot descendants, Scots-Irish settlers, free blacks, and enslaved men, all united by the necessity of survival and opposition to the heavy-handed British occupation. It was this austere existence that gave rise to one of the most enduring anecdotes of the American Revolution, a story that illustrates the psychological impact of Marion's warfare. The incident reportedly took place on Snow's Island, Marion's favorite hidden base. A young British officer was sent under a flag of truce to negotiate a prisoner exchange. To protect the location of the camp, he was led blindfolded through the labyrinth of the swamp. When the blindfold was removed, the officer found himself not in a fortified garrison, but in a clearing surrounded by ragtag men cleaning rusted weapons, the trees draped with Spanish moss. Marion, ever the gentleman despite his surroundings, invited Chuthieu, an officer, to dine. The meal, prepared by Oscar Marion, was served on a piece of pine bark. It consisted entirely of roasted sweet potatoes. There was no wine, only water and vinegar, a mixture known as switchel, to cut the thirst. The British officer, accustomed to the officers' mess in Charleston where meat and Madeira were plentiful, was stunned. He held the charred root in his hand and asked, "General, is this your ordinary fare?" "It is," Marion replied, "and we are fortunate on this occasion, having company, to have more than our usual allowance." Legend holds that the officer was so shaken by this display of asceticism that he returned to his command and resigned his commission, telling his superiors that it was impossible to defeat men who fought for liberty while sustaining themselves on nothing but roots and water. Whether the resignation occurred is a matter of debate, but the story underscores the terrifying resilience of Marion's men. They had stripped themselves of all comforts, becoming as hard and unyielding as the landscape they inhabited. This resilience was not accidental. It was a doctrine of war. Francis Marion was a veteran of the Cherokee War of 1759-1761. As a young lieutenant, he had observed how the Cherokee fought. They did not stand in lines and trade volleys. They used the terrain. They ambushed. They vanished. They prioritized surprise and psychological terror over massed firepower. Marion adapted these savage tactics for the Revolution, teaching his men to fire and fall back, to lure the enemy into traps, and to never hold ground for the sake of honor if it meant losing lives. While General Gates was losing a conventional army at Camden by trying to fight the British on European terms, Marion was inventing American guerrilla warfare. He was turning the geography of South Carolina into a weapon that the British, for all their discipline and artillery, could not counter. Marion's tactical genius lay in his ability to improvise. Cut off from continental supplies, he turned the Low Country's resources into an arsenal. When his cavalry found themselves without sabers, essential for the close-quarters skirmishing of the Southern theater, Marion did not wait for Congress to act. He raided the local sawmills. He confiscated mill saws, long, high-quality steel blades used for cutting timber. He set local blacksmiths to work, heating and hammering the industrial tools into terrifying weapons. These new broadswords were heavy, sufficiently keen and massy to hew a man down at a blow. While Marion himself retained his small dress sword, a cut-and-thrust weapon that suited his slight frame, his cavalry officers, like Peter Horry, wielded these rough-forged blades with devastating effect. This spirit of adaptation was evident in the Battle of Black Mingo Creek in September 1780. Following the disaster at Camden, Marion targeted a force of Loyalist militia commanded by Colonel John Cumming Ball, a cousin of Marion's first wife, encamped at Shepherd's Ferry. Marion attempted a surprise night attack, his trademark maneuver. However, as his horsemen crossed the wooden Willtown Bridge about a mile from the enemy camp, the thundering of hooves on the planks echoed through the quiet night. The sound alerted a sentry at the Red House Tavern, who fired a warning shot. The element of total surprise was lost. Most commanders would have retreated. Marion improvised. Recognizing that the enemy was now alert but likely confused in the darkness, he split his force. He sent a small group to create a distraction while his sharpshooters dismounted and crept through the tall grass to flank the Loyalist position. The ensuing firefight was short and brutal. Caught between the distraction and the flanking fire, the Loyalists broke and fled into the swamp. The victory yielded a significant prize, Colonel Ball's horse. Marion captured the magnificent sorrel gelding and named him Ball, riding the animal for the remainder of the war. The engagement proved that Marion's irregulars could defeat a dug-in enemy even when the initial plan went awry. Marion also refined the use of ammunition. At the Battle of Parker's Ferry later in the war, he ordered his men to load their muskets with buckshot, multiple heavy pellets per cartridge, essentially turning their rifles into shotguns. This tactic was specifically designed to counter British cavalry. A single musket ball might miss a galloping horseman, but a spray of buckshot would almost certainly hit either the rider or the mount, breaking the charge. These innovations were not merely clever tricks, they were the desperate measures of a commander fighting a war of survival. Marion understood that he could not match the British in resources, so he had to outthink them. He had to be sharper, faster, and more ruthless. By late 1780 and into 1781, Marion's brigade had evolved from a nuisance into a strategic threat capable of altering the course of the war. 2 engagements, Tearcoat Swamp and Utah Springs, demonstrate the spectrum of his capabilities, from stealth raids to open-field combat. The Battle of Tearcoat Swamp, October 1780. Weeks after Black Mingo, Marion targeted a force of Loyalists under Colonel Samuel Tynes in the fork of the Black River. Tynes had brought new muskets, saddles, and supplies from Charleston, equipment Marion's ragged men desperately needed. Learning that Tynes's men were encamped near Tearcoat Swamp and were relaxed, playing cards and sleeping without adequate sentries, Marion approached in total silence. He had learned from the mistake at Black Mingo. There would be no loud bridges this time. He moved his men like ghosts through the forest. Waiting until midnight, Marion divided his force into 3 columns, left, right, and center, to envelop the Loyalist camp. At his signal, a single pistol shot, the 3 columns roared out of the darkness. The Loyalists, many of them raw recruits, woke to a nightmare of shouting men and flashing mill-saw swords. The resistance was negligible. The Loyalists fled into the swamp, leaving behind 80 horses and their new muskets. Crucially, the psychological impact was so profound that many of Tynes's men, seeing the effectiveness of Marion's leadership and perhaps disillusioned with the British service, emerged from the swamp and defected to Marion's side. This mass switch of allegiance earned the location the derisive nickname Turncoat Swamp. The Battle of Eutaw Springs, September 1781. As the war progressed, General Nathaniel Greene took command of the Southern Continental Army and sought to integrate Marion's partisans into his grand strategy. This culminated in the Battle of Eutaw Springs, the last major engagement in the Carolinas. For this battle, Greene placed the militia, Marion's men, in the front line. In 18th century warfare, this was a position of immense danger, usually reserved for troops expected to fire 1 or 2 volleys and then retreat behind the regulars. The British commander, relying on conventional wisdom, expected the militia to crumble under a bayonet charge. But Marion's men did not run. Fortified by months of hard campaigning in the swamps and inspired by the swamp fox's presence, they stood their ground. They fired not 2 rounds, but 17. They fought with a degree of obstinacy that shocked Greene himself. Marion commanded the right wing of this line, holding firm against the veteran regulars of the British Army. Their refusal to break exhausted the British momentum, allowing the Continental regulars to advance and turn the battle into a strategic victory for the Americans. Eutaw Springs proved that Marion's ragtag band had matured into a force that could stand toe-to-toe with the Empire's best. The narrative returns to the edge of Ox Swamp, November the 8th, 1780. Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton sat on his horse, staring into the abyss of the swamp. The trail had vanished into the black water. His scouts, men who knew the land, shook their heads. To proceed was madness. The artillery would be lost. The horses, already trembling from the 26-mile sprint, would break their legs in the submerged root systems. Marion and his men were somewhere in that darkness, silent, watching, waiting for the British to make the fatal mistake of entering the water. Tarleton's face, usually flushed with the thrill of the hunt, was twisted in frustration. He had chased Lee, he had chased Sumter, and he had caught them or forced them to fight. But Marion was different. Marion was smoke. He was a creature of the environment itself, and the environment had just closed ranks to protect him. Tarleton wheeled his horse around, the animal protesting the sudden movement. He looked at his officers and delivered the line that would unknowingly baptize his enemy for eternity. "Come, my boys," Tarleton shouted, his voice carrying over the heavy breathing of the horses. "Let us go back, and we will soon find the gamecock. But as for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." The Swamp Fox. The name was born in the defeat of the Green Dragoons at the edge of Ox Swamp. It was a concession of tactical superiority, an admission that Marion had mastered a form of warfare the British could not comprehend. Tarleton turned his back on the swamp. He did not pursue further, but his fury required an outlet. If he could not catch the fox, he would burn the den. The return march of the British Legion was a trail of destruction. Tarleton made good on his reputation for terror. He returned to the Richardson plantation. He ordered the house of Mrs. Richardson, the woman who had warned Marion, to be burned to the ground. He burned the barns. He destroyed the corn. He slaughtered the livestock. Marion, emerging from the swamp later to witness the devastation, reported with a heavy heart, "Colger Tarleton has burnt all the houses and destroyed all the corn, from Camden down to Nelson's Ferry. It is distressing to see women and children sitting in the open air round a fire without a blanket." The brutality was intended to break the spirit of the rebellion. Instead, it calcified it. The sight of the burning plantations and the cruelty toward the widow Richardson proved to the South Carolinians that there could be no return to British rule. Tarleton had won the chase, in a sense, by forcing Marion to run, but he had lost the people. Francis Marion remained in the field until the bitter end. He survived the swamps, the fevers, and the starvation. When the British finally evacuated Charleston in 1782, Marion's brigade was there, emerging from the wilderness as victors. After the war, the man who had been the terror of the British Army returned, to a quiet life. He married his cousin, Mary Esther Videau, and rebuilt his own plantation, Pond Bluff, which had been ruined during the conflict. He served in the South Carolina Senate, where, in a final act of character, he opposed punishing the Tories who had fought against him. He championed amnesty, recognizing that the only way to build a nation was to heal the wounds of the Civil War. He died in 1795 at the age of 63, passing quietly in his bed at Pond Bluff. He was buried at Belle Isle Plantation, near the swamps that had been his fortress. But the legend of the swamp fox did not die. It lived on in the local memory, in the cypress trees of the Santee, and in the military doctrine of future generations. He had shown that a smaller force, fighting with knowledge of the land and the support of the people, could defy an empire. He was the ghost that the devil himself could not catch, and in the end, he was the victor.